Okay, there's a lot of interesting stuff there that we're going to get to tonight, and I know you probably have questions about that, but and we'll cover all of that. We need to turn our attention to Wesley's journey to Georgia. Excuse me. Wesley's journey to Georgia has several characteristics to it that I need to cover. On the 14th of October in 1735, they set sail, he and his brother Charles, for Georgia in the American colonies. This was at the request of a man named James Oglethorpe, who had actually founded the colony of Georgia in 1733. And he did that on behalf of the trustees for the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge. Now, what is known as the SPCK, is still in existence. This is the publishing arm of the Anglican Church. And so if you see today books put out by the Church of England, you'll see that on the bind of the book, SPCK. And so what was started in those days is still in existence, puts out all their material, Sunday school material, theological books, the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge. And they wanted Wesley to come and be a part of this new parish on Frederica and today known as St. Simon's. He was going there to be the pastor and also to participate in writing and publishing and helping get the message out there in Georgia. Wesley John assumed his priestly duties in February of 1736. And that would mean, of course, he would preach, serve the sacraments, do weddings that may be necessary, funerals, officiate in ways that clergy still do, of course, today. His primary goal, as I mentioned a moment ago, John's personal primary goal in agreeing to go do this, was to evangelize the Native Americans. But because there was such a shortage of clergy in the American colonies at the time, really he ended up serving the European settlers more than he did the American natives. Of course, the church services, the Holy Communion, and he ends up staying 2 years as the parish priest, longer than what he had planned to do. His ministry ended in disappointment, and this is some of that soap opera, and I assure you that there's more to the story, and there's even more women that come and go from John's life. So it gets a little more saucy even as we go along, as John became frustrated in his love life. Some interesting things about this situation that were not covered in the video that I'll share with you, because I know that kind of stuff makes him more human. Sophie Hopke was this young woman who her father, or rather her uncle, was what we would today call the governor of Georgia. He was the governor of the colony of Georgia, and so a very powerful man. And Sophie, it seems, we have that information from historical records, but also about what John and his brother Charles talk about. Sophie was spoken for, not officially engaged as we would think of it, but she was spoken for by this other man, but he wasn't there at the time. He worked for the British government, and he was off somewhere else in the Americas, and because he was gone, she struck up a relationship with John Wesley. Now, how close they were is unclear. Whether they were dating per se, as we would call it today. They didn't really do that kind of thing then as much. Although she does travel with him some, which was kind of questionable, but she went as they went back and forth between the cities and the villages. Then come to find out, she was also officially engaged to a man named William Williamson. So she was a colorful character, to say the least. So she's got John Wesley convinced that she's the one for him, and he would talk about in his journal that he fully intended that they were going to get engaged and get married. But then when he found out about these other men, the one that she was kind of spoken for, but then engaged to another. So she was making the rounds. I guess she was checking out, before she said yes, but she had already become engaged to this guy while she was friends with John Wesley. Williamson was also not around. He was doing other things there in the colony of Georgia. And as you know, at that time frame. Communication was limited, and he couldn't text her and just see how she's doing. Travel, of course, took several days, and so there was this time lapse. Well, when John finds out about it, as shown in the video, he refuses her communion. Now, you got to understand that he finds out she's not only engaged and is going to be married, and he has to officiate the wedding, but he also finds out that she'd had another man that was spoken for while she was, for lack of a better way to put it, I guess, fooling around with him. And so he's real frustrated and angry about this. And so he does perform the wedding because it's his job, it's his duty. He also has the pressure coming from the governor of Georgia and her relationship to the governor of Georgia. But then on a Sunday when she comes forward for communion, he refuses her. Now this sounds pretty radical for us today. Can you imagine me officiating a Holy Communion service here at Asbury? All of you participated in that, I'm sure, and I refuse somebody. It was a right of the Anglican clergy to do that, but it had to be for a better reason. For instance, if a clergyman knew that a man or a woman were engaged in adulterous activity, he could refuse them communion until they got their act straight, or sought counsel, made confession. If he knew criminal elements in a person's background, you could refuse them communion until they get their life straightened out or get back on the right track. But not for this reason, for just being mad at her because of the triangle of relationship. But he does. He refuses her communion. And of course then she gets frustrated, and as a result she levels charges of defamation of character against him, which shows that the level of the sacrament of Holy Communion had a different power to it in the Church of England at the time. This was a major deal for him to refuse her Holy Communion. She would be marked by that. So she then files defamation charges, and John realizes, I got to get out of Georgia. And so he heads back. Later in years to come, he would talk about forgiving her and realizing they both were young and immature and in a new place, a new time. But this is important because as you know, or as you will learn more about this as we go forward too, one of the hallmarks of the United Methodist Church is that we offer communion to anybody. Anybody that wants to come to receive is welcome to do so. This event in John Wesley's life would shape the way he would lead then the Methodist tradition to move beyond thinking that I know what's in a person's heart or mind, to say to them, you can take communion or you can't take communion. As you know, there are other traditions within Christianity that are different. The Roman Catholic tradition, for instance, you have to be Roman Catholic to receive the sacrament of communion. In the Orthodox tradition, they're not quite as strict, but they do have some strictures to that. And there are other Protestant denominations as well that require certain things. You have to be of a certain age, or you have to be confirmed and baptized, a Christian. Some churches even insist that you have to be a member of that local congregation before you can share in the Lord's Supper or the sacrament of communion. The Methodist tradition says, no, this is an act of grace, and so anybody that wants to come receive is welcome to do so, and we don't put boundaries upon that. That comes out of John Wesley's experience, and it would mark the early Methodist movement because he would learn a lesson from this, and he would want to make then this act of grace of opening communion to everybody that would come out of his experience. That's why it's important to realize that he learned from his mistake, if you will, and recognize that God could work in a person's life in spite of what he may think about that individual. And so from out of his own experience, he then changes the way he sees communion. He would grow in that. The most significant accomplishment for John Wesley in Georgia, was that he published a collection of psalms and hymns. Now, these psalms and hymns, of course, the collection of psalms from the Old Testament, put together in a reading format, kind of a method of reading through the psalms, as we talk about reading through the Bible, reading through the psalms. And he collected hymns both from his brother, some that he wrote. It's important to note, too, that John wrote some hymns himself, none of which are to the level of fame as his brother Charles. He also included some hymns from the Lutheran tradition that he translated himself out of German into English. What makes this important from a historical point of view is this was the first Anglican hymnal published in America, and it was done by John Wesley and through this Society for Christian Knowledge. So the first English hymn book is made by John Wesley there, and that's considered, and he would later say, the most important thing he did while he was there in the Georgia colony was the publication of this collection of psalms and hymns. Now, in the video was brought up the issue of the people known as Moravians. Now, Moravians are important both then and now. The United Methodist Church is in complete communion with the Moravian Church, which still exists today. The Moravians are a small group of Protestants that come from Germany, named for Moravia. That's why they're called Moravians, which is where they started. Now, the Moravians themselves, we have some people here at Asbury who moved here to Birmingham. There isn't a Moravian church in Birmingham. Matter of fact, there aren't very many in the South itself. There's one I know of in Huntsville, and I've been to one of their services at times, very similar to what you would experience here at Asbury. They are more prolific in the Carolinas, which is where they landed and started and planted some churches, and it's common if you're driving through hill country in North Carolina that you might see a Moravian church. Have any of you ever met a Moravian? There's a family I know of here at Asbury that transferred their membership. They came from North Carolina, from the Moravian church, and joined, of course, Asbury. I've talked to them several times. Matter of fact, I've had them be in this class from time to time and share their history and background. There is some talk, even the last few years, of the Moravian church merging into the United Methodist Church because we have so much in common. But those conversations are ongoing. But I will say this. Every person in this room knows a Moravian, or you know who they are. You know the person, you just probably do not know who the Moravian is. Andy Griffith was a Moravian, and that was his history and tradition. And if you've ever seen the Andy Griffith show, you know, the old black and white show, the way that church is caricatured in the show itself is based upon Andy Griffith's understanding of Moravian history and heritage. Many years ago, in the 1960s, something like that, early 1960s, Andy Griffith actually came out with an album of Moravian hymns. And we have many Moravian hymns in our hymnal today, and some are very beautiful. They have beautiful abilities to sing. I want to talk a little bit about the Moravians and why they were important, first from a historical point of view, but also their impact upon John Wesley. The Moravian translates from Germany, from the German, which means the Brethren Congregation from Herrnhut. It's one of the oldest Protestant denominations in the world. As a matter of fact, Moravians are known as Protestants before Protestants. If you will think about your history, in 1457, the Protestant Reformation had already come to that part of the world. This is 60 years before Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Chapel in 1517. So that's what's considered the start of the Protestant Reformation, but there were already Protestant reformers before Luther, and the Moravians were a Protestant group that had withdrawn from the Roman Catholic tradition and had formed this Moravian movement that would later become the Moravian Church. Today there's about 750,000 Moravians worldwide compared to like 13 million United Methodists. So you can see the difference. Beautiful people, and the way they talk about their faith, the way they think and talk about God's grace had a huge impact as you saw on John Wesley, which we'll talk about in more detail. It was on this voyage that Wesley is going over to Georgia, and he's on this ship, and these Moravians were on this ship as well. And this great storm comes, and what John Wesley saw was he was terrified, thought he was going to die in this great storm, but this group of Moravians were down in the belly of the ship singing hymns and having prayer, and so he goes down to join them, and he can't figure out why they're not afraid, or why they wanted to sing hymns while everybody else is in panic that the ship is going to sink. And this touched his life. He was trying to figure out well, what do they have that I don't have? And so he strikes up a friendship with some of these Moravians. This led him, an important thing here, this experience led Wesley to believe that the Moravians possessed an inner strength that he lacked. Understanding what was happening in Wesley's life is difficult for us. I think the best way I know to apply it is all of us have had those experiences before, if you think about it, where during a time of crisis you've met someone who seems to have this strength or stability that you don't, and you draw from that strength and ability. That's what Wesley experienced. It wasn't that these people were, kind of sanctified super people that were oblivious to the storm. And no, what they did was they encouraged each other by gathering and singing and having prayer. And evidently this had not occurred to Wesley. And so he was trying to figure out what this group had that he needed. And so he began to pursue that, trying to get to know them more. He returns to England, Wesley does, and he's very depressed about this. Not so much about just the storm, but about his whole experience, as you can imagine. His fleeing with Sophie and how all that worked out. His failure, he thought he was a failure as a missionary to the Native Americans. It wasn't what he thought it was going to be, and so he goes back to England real frustrated. This is a picture of Peter Bowler, who is mentioned in the video. He strikes up this friendship. He seeks him out, and he wants to talk about spiritual life. They're both clergy. Bowler, a Moravian minister, Wesley, an Anglican priest, and they start up this friendship together. Now, this friendship would, of course, lead to a change in Wesley's life, and how he describes it is very colorful, how Wesley describes what happens to him. Although we would probably be surprised to realize that he has this spiritual awakening, but it wasn't, lights and sounds and flashes from heaven and angels speaking and all of that. It was something internal to Wesley. Something happened inside. And he describes it as his heart was strangely warmed. And I always, find humor in thinking this is his way as a Oxford-trained, stiff upper lip Britishman of describing this fantastic experience that happens in his life. Whereas someone else might, wave their hands and run around the room and jump up and down and thank God I've found what I've been looking for. For him, it was a very quiet moment, but it changed everything on the inside. He had this spiritual awakening in a way that he had never experienced before in his life. And it was because of his conversation and experience with the Moravians. Now, what Wesley would later say, that I find very, very insightful, he would later say that it was not that the Moravians had something that I didn't have, and I got it from the Moravians. It was that the Moravians raised an awareness in me for something greater and deeper in my own life. Initially, he thought, these people have something I don't have. How do I get it? But what he really discovered was later, as he grew in his faith and recognized that it wasn't that they had something different or better. It was just that they raised the awareness in his own life, and he then began to seek out a spiritual experience that he had never had before. And he would credit them and always be grateful for the Moravians for raising that awareness in his life. Up until then, he had not been challenged in his faith, not like that, and it would change everything for him. He has what is known as the Aldersgate experience. This is why you will notice, if you pay attention, that there are Methodist churches that are named Aldersgate. We are named, as we will talk later in one of the sessions, Asbury was the first Methodist bishop in America, Francis Asbury, which is our namesake, and good friends with John Wesley. Wesley actually sent him here to carry on the work when Wesley got older. But Wesley never came back to America, as a matter of fact, just that one trip. But he would oversee the growth of Methodism in America years later. This plaque is there at Aldersgate Street today. One of these days, I actually had it planned before the pandemic hit. Whereas I took a pilgrimage into the Holy Land, a couple of years ago, I took people from Asbury on a Lenten pilgrimage to the Holy Land. My next trip was I was going to take them on a Methodist heritage and history trip into England, Scotland, and Wales, where Wesley traveled. And of course, we'd have a lot of fun with all that too. And we would go to Aldersgate Street. The chapel is not there anymore. There's stores. It's like a modern city now. But there is that plaque right there on the sidewalk, right there on the wall where that building was, where Wesley went. And it was here that he has this heart strangely warmed experience on Aldersgate Street. Now what this was, just an interesting side bit, because as we talked last week, that the Church of England was the state church and was the official church of England, other non-Anglicans, like Moravians or Presbyterians or whatever the case may be, they could meet, but they were not allowed to build church buildings. And they weren't allowed to call themselves churches. The only church in England at the time was the Anglican Church. But these other religious groups were allowed to gather and meet. They called them societies. As long as they called them societies and they could meet in chapels, but not in churches. I mean, the English government and the established church was very particular about that. So when it says in his journals, I went to a meeting on Aldersgate Street unwillingly to a society meeting of the Moravians. He was going to a church service on that night, but why he says unwillingly is a question. No one really knows what he means by that. It could mean, he never clarified it. He just said, I unwillingly went. Now, he's hanging around these Moravians. He's developed friendships with them, particularly Peter Bowler, the Moravian minister who's overseeing this society of Moravians that are meeting. So it's not like he was afraid of them. It could mean a couple of things, I think. As scholars talk about this, I'll just lay a couple of options. He could have meant by that that he had other things to do and he thought it's kind of a waste of time and I really don't want to go to another church service. Maybe it could have been that. It could also meant that he was careful about associating with these groups for fear that it would reflect on him as an Anglican clergyman. He had to be very careful about that. Now later he would not. He wouldn't care because now he's trying to build his career. Feels like a failure from his time in Georgia. So that could mean what it is, or he could mean something else. Who knows? But it's just kind of always hanging out there. He says, I unwillingly went. And while he was there, he has this experience described here as experience of grace. That was the beginning of Methodism in his life in that moment. On May the 24th, 1738, and this is what he had done that day because he records it in his journal. He'd gone to a concert at St. Paul's Cathedral in London and to see a choir concert at St. Paul. So remember now, he's in this kind of depressed state. One of the songs that they sang was Out of the Depths, and he uses that and describes that. Yes, that's where I am in my life. I'm in the depths. And then he unwillingly attends this Moravian meeting on Aldersgate Street, and he was listening to the reading of Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans. Now, this was some sort of a sermon, I suppose, or it was very common in those days. Remember, not everybody could read and write. And so it was very common for these gatherings, and the Church of England did it as well, to host a reading. So people would come and gather and he would read some religious material, or you would read something about the Bible. It just so happened that he went and they were reading a commentary by Martin Luther on the book of Romans, which was apropos for the Moravians because they were originally from Germany and looked to Martin Luther kind of as their spiritual leader. But he says in his journal at around 8:45, he experienced this spiritual awakening where he describes his heart as strangely warmed. Now, I have read some of Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans. And, I'll just tell you, there's nothing earth-shaking, life-changing there. It's pretty dry. And, it wasn't that changed him. It wasn't that. It was just that moment where he was there that he comes to this realization. And he never says, really, what it was about the reading that touched him, what it was about what was being said. But it was just in that moment where he comes to this realization that God's grace is available to him just as it is to anybody, and that he can have a personal relationship with the living God. Now, one of the important distinctions I think to make here for Wesley is this. Up until this point, and this really is an unfair caricature, but it's the best way I know to put it. Up until this point, much of Wesley's religion was cerebral. He was a scholar. He was an educator. He was a preacher. He was a theologian. He was all those things. But he did never, for whatever reason, and this is based on his testimony, not my, I'm not putting this off on him. For whatever reason, he says, at that moment, he experiences this heart-warming moment where it all kind of connects. All that he had learned intellectually becomes a spiritual awakening in him. Interesting about Wesley is, even though this was his experience of his heart strangely warmed, he didn't go around insisting on it for everybody else. In other words, he didn't say, hey, I had a heart-warming experience. Here's how you do that. Here's what happened to me. I'm going to pass it on to you. But he would talk about how God can, in a moment of time, take all that we're learning, all that we know, and bring it home to his heart. And that's what he means by his heart being strangely warmed. Any questions about any of that, or comments that you may have, or insights you'd like to share? You have something from the online?
We do, Pastor Kip. Two questions. The first one is, if the Moravians had such a profound effect on John Wesley, then why didn't he just join them?
Okay, so if the Moravians had such a profound effect, why didn't he just join them? Well, he did sort of. I mean, he started, hanging out with them and being around them. But there again, he saw himself as a faithful Anglican clergyman. He wasn't interested in being a part of something else. He was happy with doing what he was doing, even though he was frustrated with his own spiritual life. And he didn't desire to be a Moravian in an official sense. I think it's also fair to say that would have never even occurred to him. People did not in those days change traditions as quickly. You think about it. As I mentioned last week, English law required you to be baptized in the Anglican Church. It didn't dawn on they didn't think that way. It didn't dawn on them. Say, I don't like my bishop anymore. I'm going to go be Presbyterian, or I'm going to go be. There was especially for him, his father, his brothers. English society was very fixed. You didn't transition quickly or easily, not even in a denominational way, but people didn't transition from their state and status in life either. So it never even occurred to him or dawned upon him to do that, nor would he have desired it. But he was very open to other relations. Wesley, in his later journals, and by the way, speaking of his journals are still in print today. This is volume 13. He had 15 volumes of his journals, made up of sermons and all kinds of things like that. In his journals, he prints ongoing conversations he had with Catholic priests about all kinds of religious issues. He carried on a long correspondence over many years with a Greek Orthodox clergyman. So he was very open to learning other things. It just wouldn't have been a part of his wheelhouse to think about, I'll go be a part of that. There was also a strong connection in those days with your religious tradition had to do with your race. In other words, the Moravians were closely associated with Germany. Anglicans were associated with England, and so the crossover was not as easily done in those days. That's probably more than you wanted, but that does answer that question. Another one? One more. Okay.
So given that the Moravians were an awakening influence on John Wesley, what are some of the modern day similarities and differences between United Methodists and Moravians?
Okay. What are some of the differences and similarities? Well, I could talk about that for a while. We have much more in common than we have different, although they have their distinctions. One of the key distinctions of Moravians is they have what they call a service of light, and they usually do this on Christmas Eve. And I've been to one of those. It's quite unique. Part of their service of light is a time when in the pews they serve these little biscuits and little cups of coffee that is a part of their fellowship. They call some things differently. What we call Holy Communion, they call the love feast. And so when they share the sacrament of Holy Communion, they refer to it as the love feast. Now, things that we would have in common with them are some of the same hymns and songs. They also have bishops, just like the Methodist tradition has bishops. They baptize infants and children and adults, just as the United Methodist tradition would do. They also appoint their pastors, not call them or hire or fire them. So bishops are responsible for sending their pastors. At the World Methodist Council every year in Lake Junaluska, the Moravian bishops also gather and have their conference at the same time the United Methodist World Council is meeting. And we often work together through compassionate ministries in the world and other ways of partnering for doing good in the world with Moravians. So we have, far more in common than we would not. If you went into one of their services, as I mentioned a moment ago, sanctuary style, the colors of the liturgics, the vestments that clergy wear would be very, very similar because of the link within our tradition. That's one reason I think that Wesley and Peter Bowler and the Moravians made such a strong bond, because they had so much in common in many ways. They also would talk about grace and God's love in the same way. Of course, that's where Wesley got some of those ideas that had touched and changed his life in dramatic ways. Yes?
Why do you think that, I think the Moravians, isn't that the old Czech Republic, the Czech Republic now is where Moravia was.
Right.
Anyway.
Then it was part of Germany.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a history of helping people,
Mm-hmm.
that's one of their main tenets. But why haven't they grown internationally, like, say, the United Methodist Church or other traditions like the Baptist Church or whatever? They just had no desire to set up a worldwide organization, or what?
Well,
but not to the extent of 13 million versus 750,000.
right. And the question was, why haven't they grown like the United Methodist Church? Part of it is that they still are rooted to their ethnic heritage. There's still a very strong German influence. And I know that because of what this family that's here now has shared with me. It's very common in Moravian churches still in the United States that they speak German. It's very common that they may sing some of their songs, in German. So because of that strong link, think like, we talk about Irish Catholics. There's that link between their Catholicism and their ethnic heritage. Think Greek Orthodox. It's very common in a Greek Orthodox church to hear the language being done, in Greek. Russian Orthodox to hear it in Russian. So they still have some of those strong motivating factors. Another reason, and that's one thing we'll talk about, is because they have not been, when they came here, they were not as aggressive as United Methodist or the Methodist tradition in spreading and planting churches. They tended to coalesce, in an area. And that's one of the unique things, both about Baptist, Southern Baptist, but then there are other kind of Baptists too. My wife is from Missouri originally, and she never met a Southern Baptist until she married me. Baptists there are American Baptists, and if you go to an American Baptist church there, which I have, though she comes out of the Methodist tradition and the Lutheran tradition herself from there, you go to Baptist church. I went to a wedding a couple of years ago at First Baptist Church in Columbia, Missouri, and it looked just like worship here. Clergy wore a robe, they had acolytes down the aisle. It was very similar, so very different, even though it's part of the Baptist tradition. One of the reasons that we United Methodists are so diverse, we cover every culture, every language, every country almost around the globe. The Moravians were not as aggressive in evangelism in that way, and that's why. Mm-hmm. That's why. Okay, well, we'll move on. He says this exactly in his journal. At 9:15, while the leader was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. Now, this spiritual awakening that Wesley had would cause him to begin to rethink his theology. And so that brings us then to that first part that I pointed out to you there on page 5 in your study guide, about some of the key and controversial ways in which Wesley began to think his theology through. Now, let's not understand it like this, because this would be an error. Wesley did not take his existing theology, a part of the Anglican tradition, and throw it all out. What Wesley began to do, he began then to, after his heart-strange and warm experience, he began to write prolifically, trying to articulate what had happened in him and how he wanted to talk about that to other people in his preaching. And so he began to lay the foundation for what we would know as today as Methodist theological thinking. Now, he uses some words and phrases that we need to talk about. That's why I call them key and controversial. Remember now, English language in the 1700s, words have different meanings. And when we hear them today, we're like, what? We believe that? Well, this is how Wesley talked about that. The first one of his key and controversial theological terms is what he called Christian perfection. Now, when we hear the word perfection, we think of something flawless. Well, none of us are flawless, and there's no Christians who are flawless. I've often heard it said, you probably heard it said, if you find a perfect church and join it, it won't be perfect anymore because you're there. So, that's true. There's no such thing as Christian perfection. So what does he mean by that? God doesn't want to make us perfect. Well, in 1777, Wesley wrote still to this day, his most important and his best-selling book. You can still find this book in Christian bookstores, little small, thin book, and it was written and it's still published. And matter of fact, it's never stopped being published since 1777. And it continues to be published. This was his little track to put the message out there to the masses. That's what he was trying to do. And the plain account of Christian perfection, here's what he means by that. He is describing the process of achieving spiritual maturity. The word perfection in the 18th century in English, it didn't mean flawless, it meant maturation. So what he's talking about, to put it in our language, he's talking about how you mature your faith, Christian maturity. And in his life, he didn't feel he had that. And that's what he found in his heart being strangely warmed. So he would later talk about that as Christian holiness, in other words, where we mature in our love toward God and to our neighbor. An important component of Wesley's thought about Christian maturity or Christian perfection is that those two always go hand in hand. Wesley became convinced that you cannot love God wholeheartedly and not love your neighbor. And he would also say that you can't love your neighbor wholeheartedly without loving God. He also saw those two together. And that's what he meant by Christian holiness, that we mature in our love of God and our neighbor through life's journey. And he saw life itself as a Christian as a process of maturation, that there's a process of growth, and you're growing in your love for God and for neighbor. And over time, as you stay with that, as you follow through on your spiritual life, your love for God grows stronger, your love for neighbor grows stronger. He always saw those two linked. That's what he means by Christian perfection or Christian maturity, that there's a need on all of our part to mature our faith. And this book became a bestseller in England at the time because people were hungry for a way of understanding how I can grow my faith in Christ. When you hear me stand up in the pulpit on any given Sunday and talk about growing your faith in Christ, that's what Wesley means by a plain account of Christian perfection. And the reason he chooses those words is this is his testimony. And what he's wanting to say is, I just want to give a plain account for the common person about how they can grow their faith. This is what happened in my life. Now I want to pass that on to you. And what is lost on us in our world today, that's a common thing to hear me say. Here's how you grow your faith. You need to grow your faith to have a meaningful relationship with Jesus Christ. Nobody was talking like that in the English church at the time. Wesley took that language and made it applicable for the average English person of his day. And it spread like wildfire. It threatened the established church because he was talking about a dynamic relationship with God. People were not talking about that in those days. People were talking about doing all the things you have to do, but they weren't talking about this plain account of Christian maturity. Another one is what he talked about, another key phrase or term is perfect love. That's that idea of loving God and loving neighbor. So Wesley preaches about Christian perfection, Christian maturity, and then he talks about and writes about perfect love. Now what he means by perfect love is this, and I think the way I would sum it up like this in a succinct fashion, Wesley never believes or taught or felt that we can all come to the place where we love God perfectly. Many people have misunderstood what he means by perfect love. What he means by it is not that we can grow our faith to a level of spiritual height where we love God perfectly. We're always going to fall short. We're always going to need to confess. We're always going to need to repent. We're always going to have times when we're feeling as if, man, I am full of faith, and other times when we're not. What he means by perfect love is that we can come to an awareness, in spite of our own shortcomings, that God loves us perfectly. And by perfect, he means that there is nothing we do, ever do, or don't do that would make God love us less. See, one of the ways that this message about perfect love resonated within the English community at the time was put yourself in place of the people outside the established church, people living in poverty, people working in the coal mines, people that did not have enough money to buy a pew tax. How would you feel about God loving you like that? Wesley came along and said, your status in life has nothing to do with God's love. You are not poor because God put you there. You are not rich because God put you there. You're not working in the coal mines because God put you there, and you're not working at the tanner shop because God put you there. God's love for you is perfect. God loves you with an everlasting love, and you can never fully comprehend God's love for you. Again, like Christian maturity or perfection, perfect love reached into the heart of masses. And here comes Wesley out in the countryside preaching to people who had not been in a church for years and said to them, God loves you with an everlasting perfect love. And people began to respond to that. People began to, again, this was not being said. This was not being taught. This was not being preached. This was not the way in which they talked about faith. But Wesley began to recognize what I've been trying to do. Wesley would say this, and I'll paraphrase what he says in his journal here, where he's in this letter dated June the 5th, 1787. He says, only do not forget strongly and explicitly to urge the believers to go on to perfection. He means maturity, to go on to spiritual maturity. When this is constantly and earnestly done, the Word is always clothed with power. Later on in that letter, and this is the part I'll paraphrase, what Wesley means by perfect love is this, that you and I can cross all the T's, dot all the I's, but we can miss this dynamic relationship with God until we come to the fact and recognize that God does love us, and we don't have to do anything to get God to love us anymore. We don't have to do anything to get God to accept us. God's love is perfect for us from the beginning. And Wesley would go forth to say that he considered love as God's reigning attribute. And he would talk more in his journals as well. He would say, far too many people think of God as omnipotent, and God is, or omniscient, and God is. But he would say they often forget that God is also not only omnipotent and omniscient, but God is also omnibenevolent. And he said, you can have a powerful God, but if there's not love in the mix, you don't have a relationship. That God is this God up there somewhere that controls everything and has put me in this station in life and set the record here and made it. But what about God's love? And he would draw on that from 1 John 4:8, which says God is love, not just that God loves, but that God is love. And so his idea of perfect love came from this love can reign and rule in our heart. Love for God, love for neighbor, when we accept the fact that God loves us perfectly with an everlasting love. And that everlasting love, I think, is important too, that Wesley would say that we never fall out of that love. In other words, God never comes to us and says, you know what, I've been giving you a lot of grace here, but you just keep blowing it. So I'm going to take that love and I'm going to give it over here to this person. You know, I love you. You know, God's not one of those parents that has the favorite child and you're not it, but that God loves us perfectly. A third, and the last one that we'll talk about tonight, which was a big word for Wesley, that was a key phrase and creates controversy for a lot of people, is the idea of sanctification. Now, he's using the Latin here. To sanctify means to set something aside for a special purpose. And so he preached about being made holy and sacred, not in the sense that, you know, God's going to purify you and you're going to reach a place in life where you're just completely pure. That's a lot of people that do a casual reading of Wesley think that's what he means. But that's not what he means. What he means by sanctification is this, and he defines it like this: that your heart is habitually filled with love of God and neighbor and as having the mind of Christ and walking as He walked. Sanctification is for him the term he used for the process of spiritual growth, for the process of spiritual maturity, for developing a meaningful relationship with God and neighbor. God will sanctify, meaning God will set you apart for a special purpose. And that special purpose is to grow your faith. That special purpose is to live your faith out in the world that is around you. And at the heart of all of this, whether you're talking about Christian perfection or perfect love or sanctification, at the heart of all of this is grace. What Wesley does is he places grace, God's love and our love for neighbor, God's love for us, our desire to grow our faith. Wesley places at the center of it all grace. And by grace, what he means is God's unconditional love for us regardless, and that grace is always extended to us. Again, a very different message than was being preached and proclaimed and taught in churches in England for the most part. And he talked about grace, Wesley talked about grace in three movements. And what I mean by that, by three movements, is that Wesley didn't just talk about it, say, you know, God's grace is available to you. He wanted to actually figure out a way where he could help people understand from his perspective how God's grace works in your life. And it came from his own testimony. Now again, he uses some phraseology that we need to break down. His grace in three movements is like this. First, he talked about what he called prevenient grace. Now, here's a barrier for our language. We hear the word prevent, but that's not what he means by that. The word prevenient, in the way he's using it, means a grace that goes before your awareness. And here's where Wesley was considered a radical by many theologians of his day. Wesley taught and believed, and is a part of the DNA of our Methodist heritage even today, that God's grace is available to every person. And that grace is at work in people's lives even when they don't realize it. Wesley would say it like this: an atheist, and Wesley had relationships with many atheists or professed atheists at Oxford. Remember now, he was a part of the intellectual world. And he carried on long correspondence with many atheists who wanted to challenge him on his faith, and he would respond in turn. But he would make this point about prevenient grace. If God's grace is at work even when a person doesn't know it, drawing them to God's heart, he said, how do you explain the conversion of an atheist? And he tells about a friend of his who he went to school with at Oxford, who was an atheist, who eventually became a Christian and became a part of the Methodist movement. He said, when did God's grace start in his life? When he came forward, made a profession of faith, and accepted God's goodness and forgiveness? Was that when? No. He says God's grace was at work in his life, making him think about things about faith, wonder about things, question things. Why does Wesley seem so passionate about God? I'm as educated as he is, or he's as educated as I am. All the years he spent questioning things. Wesley would say that's God's grace at work in his life. And God's grace is always drawing you to a relationship with the living God. even when a person says they don't believe in God. Wesley would even say this, I like the way he puts that, atheists have to have a God not to believe in, which is true. And he said what that is God's grace, the prevenient grace of God. But what is the prevenient grace of God wanting to do? Well, Wesley would take that to the next level. And he would say what he called the prevenient grace, God's grace, drawing a person to the heart of God, then draws them to what he calls justifying grace. Now, what he means by justifying grace is this, that if God's grace is available to every person, and God is reaching every person through the power of the Holy Spirit preveniently, even before they know it or even before they're aware of it, that's another reason why we practice infant baptism. God's grace is at work in that young life to help that young child grow in faith, to come to the confirmation moment where they profess faith for themselves. All of that is a part of God's prevenient grace. What is justifying grace? Justifying grace is the realization that because God's grace is at work in my life, I am justified to go to God with my heart, my prayers. In other words, God is not waiting on me to get my life together and then start living a Christian life. God takes all of the muck and the dirt and the doubt and the confusion and continues to work in us, and that any person is justified to come before God. This idea directly came out of Wesley's abhorrence later of the idea of people buying a pew in church. They seem to have the resources to be a part. Well, what about these people who don't? How are they going to be a part of God's grace? He would speak of that in a justifying way. That there's justifying grace. Prevenient grace, God is working before we even know it. Why is God doing that? Because He wants to bring us to a place where we know that, hey, I am a child of God. I'm justified in having a relationship with God. And even though society may say this about me, or my economic status may be here, or in Wesley's world, I'm not even allowed to be a part of what all is taking place in the established church at the time. Wesley would come along and say, no, wait, you are just as justified to come before God with an open heart as the Duke and Duchess. You in the coal mines are just as justified to come to God because God's grace is at work in your life. And what is God wanting to do then? He comes then to what he calls sanctifying grace. And he sees this as a process. It's a mistake, I think, to understand this as steps, like step 1, prevenient grace, step 2 is justifying grace, step 3 is sanctifying grace. Rather, Wesley sees it as a process of relationship. In other words, God's prevenient grace is always at work in our lives. We're always seeking that justification to come before God and say, I come with my heavy heart, I come with my concerns, my burdens, my fears. And what is God wanting to do in that whole process? To sanctify us, to mature us, to grow us. And Wesley would see that process as happening from birth to death. That whole life is a process of God's grace at work. But he wanted to have terminology that would have been appropriate for the culture of the time to say, hey, this is how you think about God's grace. And when you think about it like this, it becomes a dynamic at work in you and through you in a way like you had not perhaps imagined before. And it's quite enlightening for people to realize, wait a minute, yeah, I remember my days, when I was in college and doing what I wanted to do and living like a barbarian and all the things I've done, and suddenly I have a spiritual wake-up moment and I come to Christ, and well, what is that? That's God's grace. God's grace is at work in life. How I would take all of this, now this is Kip talking now, how I would take all of this and say, okay, what is Wesley trying to say here? How should we hear this? What Wesley was ultimately saying was, because of God's grace, God never gives up on you. You may give up on God, or you may give up on faith, or you may give up on a spiritual life, but God never gives up on you. So if you're not ready right now to have a dynamic relationship with God, when you are ready, God will be right there to say, I'm ready too. God never says, hey, I gave you a shot years ago, you blew it. God's grace never gives up on you. That's ultimately what Wesley was wanting to say. And think about the world of Wesley. Many of the people that Wesley was preaching to, particularly in this time in his ministry, felt given up on. The government had given up on them. People had given up on them. The world, there was a whole, he comes along and talks about grace in a way that says, okay, I can't fix all these things, but I tell you what I can do. I can tell you that God is not going to give up on you. And that's grace. And that's what you need. That's how you need the most in your life. Any questions or comments about this part, this understanding of grace in Wesley's life? Yes?
We do, Pastor Kip. Are these three movements of grace what is meant when Wesley's theology is referred to as bridge theology?
Are these three here, if I understand the question right, that's why I'm repeating it back to you, if these three here, because of this, is that why Wesley's theology is often called bridge theology?
Correct.
I would assume that you could make that case. God is building a bridge to you. Where the bridge idea comes from is some terminology that Wesley used in Latin, meaning via media, which means in the middle. Building a bridge, meaning in the middle. Via media is a way in which Wesley talked about how the great tradition of the past in the life of the church builds a bridge to the present. In other words, the church itself, and he's talking about not just the Anglican church, but primarily, is not just a relic of the past, but it has something really to say to us in this day and time. And our job as Christians today, be it clergy or laity, is to build bridges between the great history of the church that we inherit and how people can come to know God's love and the good news of Jesus Christ today. So in that sense, grace is what builds that bridge between us and between God. But the way he talks about the bridge is how we relate the message of the good news to the world around us. And he always said, Wesley would say many times, if the church doesn't practice via media, if the church does not build a bridge to its culture around it, then the culture moves on and leaves it behind and misses the message. And in Wesley's mind, that's what had happened. He saw, he understood the church itself was this powerful establishment that wasn't reaching these people, that wasn't building a bridge to these people. And he wanted to build that bridge. You know, Wesley was not a revolutionary in the sense he wanted to burn the church down and start over. He wanted the church to become relevant in the lives of these people. And he discovered that the only way to do that was for him to go out there and do it. Go out there and talk to them about their faith and preach to them. You know, you build it and they will come. That's true in some ways. But Wesley said we got all these great cathedrals all throughout England and nobody's going. So we need to go where they are and try to figure out ways of connecting them to God. That's usually what the bridge idea means. But it would be grace for sure that was driving that work of God in the world. Other questions or comments that you have about this? There is a quote here that I'm expecting you to write down that I want to leave you with tonight. That Wesley speaks about the soul and pure religion. A famous quote from him is this. He says, "Let our hearts be joined herein. Let us unite our wishes and prayers. Let our whole soul pant after a general revival of pure religion and undefiled, the restoration of the image of God, pure love in every child of man." This prayer was a prayer that Wesley printed out on these little cards. And as you'll see later on in next week's session and in the other sessions to come, the small groups of Methodists who begin to meet all throughout England and eventually Scotland and Wales and beyond for spiritual nourishment, just like those young guys had done at Oxford in the Holy Club. Wesley modeled that among Methodists as the Methodist movement began to spread throughout England. He organized them in small groups, some Bible studies. And in that, he printed out this prayer on these little cards, and he would say, I want you to pray this prayer at the conclusion of each time when you're together. And what he's asking for in this prayer is a general revival of pure religion. What he means by that is a spiritual awakening. Wesley wanted the same thing that happened in him to happen and grip the very soul of England itself. And it would happen. It would take place. And it would happen, they say, because this prayer, which is kind of clunky in the way we talk today, but for that day and time, this became the Wesley prayer as people prayed it at the end of these gatherings and Bible studies. And it would really become prophetic because it would then fulfill this revival of pure religion in the lives and hearts. And he's just talking about a spiritual awakening that happens. Now, the ultimate thing that I want you to take away from tonight is this, as you reflect on the information and what we've talked about and his theology of grace, and we'll come back to that somewhat as it overlaps with where we're going. But here's what I want you to not to miss, is that what we have in John Wesley at this point is we have a man on the one hand who is doing all the right religious things. And you could put a long list that's there. So on the one hand, Wesley is being very religious. He's got his education, he's developing his theology, he's translating the Bible into English, and he's doing all the things. He's attending worship, he's practicing Holy Communion regularly, he's doing all the religious things. But through the Moravians and through his maturation himself, what he discovers is that this religion that he's following has not translated into revival, meaning that it has not warmed his heart. And what happened for Wesley was his religious activity became for him a revival, a spiritual awakening. And Wesley's greatest goal in life, and he would say he never got it exactly right. He would work on it all of his life after that event of his heartstrings you warm, is how you take religious people who do all the right things, say all the right words, how do you translate that into a revival of the soul? And that's what he means here by the pure religion, undefiled. He's talking about, I want to know how to help people get from here to here, to move from just being religious to actually having a spiritual revival that changes their heart of hearts. That is the very essence of Wesley's passion, because that's what happened to him, and that's what would happen to untold thousands of people through his work and through his ministry, and that's what would actually birth the Methodist movement itself, because he moved from just practicing religion to actually having revival, spiritual awakening. Interesting about Wesley is he didn't think you could have one without the other. He wanted you to have the tradition and all the religious things that we do, but he said it's the Spirit of God that can breathe new life into all of that and can awaken you in that moment. And you can have that kind of revival in your heart of hearts. Now, how would Wesley take this theology that we've talked about tonight and then translate that into actual practice? How would he make it practical for the average person? That's what we will talk about next week. Now, I want to call your attention to this on the schedule. Next week, we're going to be talking about the Wesleyan quadrilateral. Now, don't let that phrase frighten you. It's not a disease or some kind. God knows we don't need another pathogen. What the Wesleyan quadrilateral is, and I say this without being melodramatic, once you understand this, you'll understand Wesley. And you'll understand the Methodist movement. And you'll begin to understand, hey, wait a minute, that's why Asbury does that. Wait a minute, that's why Pastor Kip talks about that. That's why we are doing this. The quadrilateral itself is a very practical way in which Wesley sought to take this. How do we get from here, to that spiritual awakening? And he did it one day. He was at a table, sitting at a table, writing, and he noticed that one of the legs on the table was shorter than the other three. And it made the table rock. You've had that experience before. You've been in a restaurant, and the table's like that. Isn't that annoying? And what do? You take 5 packs of Sweet and Low and stick them, down there. Everybody's done that. Wesley was sitting at this table, and he noticed this 4-legged table, and he noticed that one was shorter than the other, and it kept rocking back and forth. And so he tried to move the table around on a level of the floor, and it didn't work. And in that moment, he developed what is known as the Wesleyan Quadrilateral. How you take his ideas, his grace, his theology of prevenient grace and justifying grace and sanctifying grace, and how he takes what happened inside of him, his heart strangely warmed, how does he communicate that to the masses? And it was ingenious how he did it, and it was done in a very practical sort of way. And that's what the Wesleyan Quadrilateral is, and that's what we'll talk about next week. Don't forget to take a gander at some of the resources if you want. For those that are with us online, I'll mention 3 real brief before we go, since we've dealt with John Wesley's theology. 2 classic works that are still in print today, one called John Wesley's Theology Today by Colin Williams. Colin Williams is no longer living, but was a very important, noted Australian Methodist scholar on the work of Wesley. This one here, John Wesley's Theology Today, is a later version of the same, or rather this one is a later version of this one. There are some edits and changes in that, so as you check them out online or on Amazon, the one that I would recommend is not the plain cover one, but the one that has the kind of the picture, because it's the most updated one of the work. I mentioned the works of Wesley themselves that you can access. One of the neat things about John Wesley's works, this multi-volume of his works, is you can read one without the others, and you can just pick up anywhere and start. It's not an ongoing narrative, but rather it's a collection of sermons and letters and journals, and so you can pick up any of the volumes, thumb through it, and if it interests you and you want to get others, then you feel free to do that. So next week, excuse me, at 6:30, we will have the 3rd session on the Wesleyan Quadrilateral, and we're going to go back, and you'll see why I linked that with the Quadrilateral, and talk about the Methodist Circuit Riders. They're a fun, that's a fun discussion when you start thinking about, and I started to mention that a while ago, but I thought I'd wait till now. Your question about why the Moravians did not grow and why Methodism did. Methodism grew exponentially. Do you realize, most people don't, that at the time of the Civil War, 1 in 4 Christians in America were Methodist. It had spread that quickly, and one of the reasons it did is because of the Quadrilateral, Wesley's very practical way to get out of his head and into the lives of people to say, here's how this can make a difference in your life. And the second was the Methodist Circuit Rider, particularly here in America. And the Methodist Circuit Rider is an exciting way to say, that's why Methodism spread. And it was the genius and idea of Wesley to figure out, okay, how are we going to take this message out there? Well, to put it in a way we would say it, he decided to do it the cowboy way. And that's how the Methodist Circuit Rider made a difference in America. And it said at one time in America, the Methodist Circuit Rider was the most recognizable figure in American Christianity, because they rode through every town and they went through every nook and holler. And that's why to this day, particularly here, like say in Alabama or even the South itself, you ever notice you'd be driving down this rural road out in the middle of nowhere and there sits this little Methodist church? How in the world did that church get there? Where are the people? Well, the people are gone now.